Now, friends, where are you from? Where are you really from? These are questions that I am not allowed to ask anymore, it seems, these days. But if you asked me, if pressed, I would say my sense of place is that where I am from rests here. On the left is my grandparents' grave, on the right is my uncle, and just beyond them is my great-grandparents' grave, and then just the other side of the cemetery is their great-great-grandparents. This is in Rye Harbour, and they're all within a few metres of the church that they worshipped in most weeks. Now, if I heard that the tombstones were broken down and there had been a bonfire up against the doors of the church and the doors were off their hinges and the roof had holes in it, perhaps a bit like this, then I would be devastated. And that's what happened to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a man that we meet in the Bible who lived in a place called Susa, but his home for him was in Jerusalem. Now, I've put a map up which helps us to see where Jerusalem is. It's part of Israel, and we're in England in the top left, as you can see, and then all the way at the other end of the Mediterranean Sea is Israel. It's about 3,000 miles away. Now, Nehemiah lived in a time when the people of Israel had lost access to Israel, and so they had been taken to a city called Susa, which is the one on the right-hand side that's been ringed for you. It's about 800 miles from Jerusalem. And when Nehemiah heard news about Jerusalem itself, his home city, that it was in ruins and the people who lived there didn't have the political strength to restore it, so he sat down and he wept and he fasted for days and days. A bit like that one. For days and days and days. Now, all that we read in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, which was last week, and if you want to hear more about that, you need to basically read and listen to what happened last week. But out of this place of weeping and praying and fasting and talking to God, in other words, out of this place of intimacy, so Nehemiah had courage. Now, what I want you guys to do, not just you guys at the front, but everybody, is to listen out for those moments of courage from Nehemiah in this week's reading. Now then, two things might help you. In a different book of the Bible, in Esther, where Esther was also a Jew, she was also living in Susa, in this place, but under a different king. She was incredibly afraid to go and see the king, even though the king was her husband. And this is what she said to her uncle when her uncle asked her to go and visit. And basically she said, look, if I go and see the king, then I would be put to death unless the king held out his golden scepter to me to say, it's okay, you can approach. In other words, it was sensible to please the king in the place that you worked, or the place that these guys lived, in Susa. The second thing, in terms of thinking about courage, I want you to think about, is just a couple of weeks ago, we watched a film called We Bought a Zoo, which is no ancient film now, but in it, the dad of the plot talks about how sometimes you just need 20 seconds of courage to change the world, or to change your world. So look out for those 20 seconds of courage, or less, from Nehemiah, and there might well be more than one of them. We're going to talk about them in a moment. But first of all, a king needs a throne, and a king needs a crown. Are you coming? You're going to take your snood off, like we talked about. And the king has a cupbearer called Nehemiah. There you go, there's a cup to bear. Ah, yes, you need a yes. And I'm going to hand this over. Here we go.
In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Xerxes, when wine was brought to him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I have not been sad in his presence before, So the king asked me,
Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart.
I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me,
What is it you want?
Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, If it pleases your king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. And then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me,
How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?
It pleased the king to send me. So I set a time. I also said to him, If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governor of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I occupy. And because of the gracious hand of God, my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Holarite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites.
Dum, dum, dum. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thank you very much. You may now go and take your seat. You can give me the cup back if you want. Fine, thank you. Bless you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What to do with that? Put that there. So, did you spot the moments of courage that I talked about? Can anybody give me an example of any moment of courage that you saw in or heard in that reading from Nehemiah, the cupbearer who came to talk to the king? Nobody on the front row? I've got Tim at the back here. Go on, Tim, talk to me. Okay, that's helpful to hear that. I was trying to think about the reading itself rather than how the reading was presented. Any thoughts about Nehemiah and his courage in particular?
Well, he had to go and he asked for letters. He was a bit anxious about it. He asked for letters so he would have safe travel.
Okay, so he asked for letters so he could have safe travel. But before we ask for letters, I want to suggest that the first courageous thing he did was turn up for work. Okay? He'd been crying and mourning and weeping for days, and yet he knew that unless he was physically ill, he needed to go to work. So his first moments of courage was probably that. What we got in the Bible was, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So Nehemiah could have thrown a sickie. He could have called in sick and said, look, I can't manage this. I'll get someone else to cover my shift. But no, he followed through and he turned up for work. And the king notices and asks him, is this sadness of heart? You know, is there some kind of relationship breakdown? Are you sad here because of this? But the second moment of courage for Nehemiah, I think, is in answering that. Let me show you again what it said in the Bible. I was very much afraid, and I answered the king. But I said to the king. So that's the second thing. Although he was really fearful, he said to the king, what did he say? He said, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad where the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Now, this is, remember, a city that is 800 miles away, a city that Nehemiah was taken from as a captive, or maybe his parents were, and he was born in captivity. We don't really know the detail, but certainly he feels that's his home historically, and it's burnt up, and it's broken down, and he's just heard, or had heard some days before, just what a terrible state the city was in. So at this point, he's not asking for the king for anything. He's just telling the king, look, this city that you destroyed when you took my people captive is in a really bad state. But he's not quite laying the blame on the king's door, is he? He's being a bit more diplomatic than that. So what was the third moment of courage? If the first one was answering the first question, or first statement from the king, or the second one was anyway, what do you think the third moment of courage might be? Anybody got any clues? Any thoughts? And anybody? What happened next? Having told the king about how bad the city was, what was the king's question next? He did. So the king said to him, what is it you want? Now notice this for a speedy prayer. Then I prayed, and I answered the king. But you can imagine, here's Nehemiah with his cup of wine, just presenting it to the king. You can't imagine that Nehemiah says, hang on a minute, king, I need to go off and have a 20-minute prayer meeting about this. It's very much a quick, God help me kind of prayer, isn't it? But he answered the king. And what did he say to the king? He said to the king, if it pleases the king and if your servant has found favor, then send me to the city where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. In other words, he said, please let me go home. Please let me leave being the cupbearer to you, the king, and let me go home and rebuild my city. And we talked before about moments of courage, and actually that is a huge moment of courage. And no wonder, even though he was afraid after the first question, no wonder he prayed after this question, because it was a life-changing statement, wasn't it? Can I stop being a slave, and can I go home and be the hero of my people? It's a huge change that Nehemiah's asking for. And the king says, yes, you can go. It pleased the king and the queen to let him go, he says. And I just think that is astounding, that the king is willing to let his most trusted slave go home and sort out the city that he grew up in. And it's outrageous, if you like. It's a kind of God thing. Because actually, if the king had said no, quite probably Nehemiah would have lost his life. But as it was, Nehemiah kept his life, and Nehemiah grew in confidence, and the next thing he says to the king is, well, if it pleases the king, may I have letters? Letters to do this, letters to do that, letters for a safe passage home, letters to get wood for the city, to rebuild the gates of the city, and the temple, that is effectively the church. And all of that happened in Nehemiah's eyes because, and this is where our Bible memory verse comes in, because the gracious hand of my God was on me, so the king granted my requests. So if you like, Nehemiah found God's favor because of, if you like, the prior one, and he put himself right with courage that didn't need to last very long in that case, but courage to ask for change. Now, there's another chap involved in this rebuilding of the city. It's called Ezra. And Ezra was a priest, and Ezra and Nehemiah worked together in rebuilding Jerusalem. And he's described in a similar way. Ezra is described like this. Ezra is described as arriving in Jerusalem after 4 months of journeying, the 800 miles. And it says, for the gracious hand of God was on him, that he survived the journey because he went on his own, unlike Nehemiah, who took an armed guard with him. Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. So for Ezra, there's a sense in which he was really keen to understand what for him was the Bible and to put it into practice and to help others to understand it too. And then we have to ask about us, really. Do you want to be in that place where you can clearly say that the gracious hand of God is on you? Where, if you like, God then brings about extraordinary events through you. If so, then I think, like Ezra, we need to be reading and studying and putting our Bible into practice. In other words, if you like, one way of looking at it is to say, Ezra goes back, and at one point, this was how it's described. Ezra had told the king that the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him. Everyone who looks to him. Not just church leaders, not just theologians, but everyone who looks to God, who wants to take... to honor God with your life, with your words, with your actions. When you go to school, when you go to caring hands, when you go to the shops, when you go to the school gates, all of these points, when we're looking to God, looking to honor him, we're told that the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, who looks to honor him. And I just think that is astounding. That what we read of and we think of perhaps as a special case, we can see as being normal. This is how God acts. This is how God is. God's favor was on Nehemiah, partly, yes, because this was God's plan, but particularly because Nehemiah showed both intimacy in his inner life with God and courage in his interactions with people. So it's not just prayer, it's action too. So one of my thoughts for you is, would you, out of that intimacy, out of that choosing to pray, choosing to have an inner life that is aligned with God's will, would you also act, even for 20 seconds, to say something like, can I pray with you? Do you want to know Jesus? Would you come to church with me? I know I'm forgiven by God. Or even, yes, I go to church. Those are the moments of courage that I think come from the people that we are called to be. So I want to ask you this week, what situations do you think you'll find yourself in where you'll need perhaps 20 seconds of courage? Or perhaps, like Nehemiah, just a moment of courage? Because those, my friends, are life-changing moments of courage.